Right, today we're going to talk about something that gets right to the heart of what it means to move, to speak, really to live. We're talking about motor neuron disease, or MND for short.
So, let's start with a question to get our heads around this. Just think for a second about your body's command and control system. That amazing network that takes a simple thought and turns it into an action, like picking up a cup. What happens when that system just starts to break down? That's really the central question when we talk about MND.
All right, let's get right into it. So, first things first, what actually is motor neuron disease? Well, it's what's known as a progressive condition, and that just means it gets worse over time. And its target, a very specific part of us, the body's motor system. Okay, so if we break it right down to basics, MND is a disease of our nerve cells, but not just any nerve cells, specifically the motor neurons. Think of these as the body's messengers. They're the ones carrying instructions all the way from your brain to your muscles, telling them exactly what to do. The problem with MND is that these absolutely vital cells start to break down. They degenerate.
And it's pretty logical what happens next. When those messengers fail, the muscles simply don't get the signals they need to work. And the direct result of that? Well, you get weakness, you get muscle wasting, the technical term for that is atrophy, and you get these little visible twitches under the skin, which doctors call fasciculations.
Right, to really get a handle on this, we need to look a bit closer at the body's command chain, if you like. It's basically a two-part system, and it involves something called upper and lower motor neurons.
So this whole pathway works in two stages. You've got the upper motor neurons, or UMNs. Think of them as the generals, right? They're in the brain, and they send the big orders down the spinal cord. Then you have the lower motor neurons, or LMNs. They're like the officers on the ground. They get that order from the spinal cord and carry it directly to the muscles, telling them to contract. And here's the key thing about MND. It affects both parts of this chain.
And this image really shows you what's happening at the cellular level. I mean, look, on the left, you've got a healthy, strong nerve doing its job, delivering that signal. But then look at the right. You can see what MND does. The connection is weaker. The nerve itself is, well, it's withering away. This is the devastating breakdown that's happening inside the body.
So, how does a process this devastating actually start to show itself on the outside? Let's talk about the path to a diagnosis, because it often begins with some very, very subtle signs.
Yeah, the start of MND can be really subtle and honestly quite confusing for the person experiencing it. It usually kicks off in just one area, what doctors call asymmetric weakness. So someone might just notice a bit of weakness in one hand or maybe a foot, and along with that might come those muscle twitches we talked about, some cramps, and maybe even some changes in their speech, making it sound a bit slurred.
Now here's a very specific clinical sign. When those lower motor neurons that control the tongue get affected, it can cause these visible twitches, these fasciculations. And that's absolutely one of the things a doctor will be looking for during an exam.
And here's another classic sign. This is something called the split hand sign. You can actually see this really distinct pattern of muscle wasting in the hand. Some muscles are shrinking away, while others right next to them are spared. It's this very specific pattern that is a massive red flag for MND. So this brings us to a really crucial point for doctors, and it's a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, you've got signs of the lower motor neurons being damaged. That's the muscle wasting and the twitching. But then at the very same time, the person has really brisk reflexes, which is actually a sign of upper motor neuron damage. Getting both of those signs together in the same limb, that is a huge, huge clue that points directly towards MND.
So at the end of the day, the diagnosis is what we call clinical. It's based on what the doctor finds during their physical examination. But to be sure, and to really understand how widespread the problem is, they'll use a test called an EMG. That's short for electromyography. And this test can actually show the electrical evidence of nerve damage spreading through the body.
Okay, so this is really important. Right now, there is no cure for MND, but that absolutely does not mean there's nothing that can be done. Far from it. So let's look at how the condition is managed. Not just to prolong life, but, and this is so important, to improve the quality of that life.
When it comes to management, it really boils down to three key pillars. You've got drug therapy, which aims to slow things down a bit. You've got respiratory support using ventilation. And you've got nutritional support, often with feeding tubes. So let's take a quick look at each one of those. Right, the main drug that's used is called Riluzole, and the thinking is that it works by calming things down at the cellular level. It reduces something called glutamate toxicity, which is basically when there's too much of a chemical messenger that can overexcite and damage the neurons. Now, it's not a cure, let's be clear, but studies have shown it can prolong survival by about 2 to 3 months, and when you're in that situation, that is absolutely valuable time.
But if we're talking about the single most important intervention for extending life, it's this: non-invasive ventilation, or NIV. See, as the disease gets worse, the muscles we use to breathe start to get weaker. This machine, it's a mask they wear, usually at night, it helps the person breathe. It takes the strain off those tired muscles. And the impact this has on prolonging life is huge. Honestly, it's more significant than any other treatment available.
Another big challenge is swallowing. It can become really difficult and even dangerous for many people with MND. So, to make sure they get all the nutrition and hydration they need without the risk of choking, something called a PEG tube can be fitted. It's a small tube that goes directly into the stomach, and it's a massive factor in helping people maintain their strength and, just as importantly, their quality of life.
Now, we do have to be direct about the prognosis here. MND is, unfortunately, a progressive and terminal illness. And typically, after a diagnosis is made, the median survival time, that's the middle-of-the-road figure, is somewhere between 3 and 5 years.
Okay, so we've covered a fair bit of ground there. Let's just pull it all together. What are the absolute key things you need to remember about motor neuron disease?
All right, let's recap. First, the big diagnostic clue is that strange mix of both upper and lower motor neuron signs happening at once. Second, remember, it's a disease that doesn't start everywhere at once. It starts in one spot and then spreads gradually. Third, and this is a really important point, a person's sensation isn't affected. They can still feel touch, pain, and heat perfectly fine because the disease only goes for the motor system. And finally, the single most effective thing we can do right now to extend life is that non-invasive ventilation, the NIV.
And that really brings us to our final thought. We've seen how treatments like NIV can genuinely significantly extend and improve the lives of people with MND. And what that shows us is that progress is possible. So the question it leaves us with is, what's next? What is the next big frontier for research that might be able to turn management into an actual cure?